Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're plunging into a topic that's stirred up quite a bit of debate: intelligent design.
Right. We've got this whole stack of source material you've given us, articles, notes, research, all focused on ID.
And our mission really is just to unpack it based only on these sources. What is it? Where did it come from? The concepts, the criticisms, the legal stuff.
Exactly. We're basically guides here. We'll sort through the material, pull out the important bits, maybe some surprising facts too.
The idea is to give you a clear picture of what the sources say is key without getting totally lost in the weeds.
Let's do it.
Okay, so where do we start? History seems like the place. The sources call intelligent design, or ID, a specific pseudoscientific form of creationism.
Yeah, and the roots, they go way back, centuries actually, back to theological arguments, like the argument from design.
Also called the teleological argument.
That's the one, arguing for God's existence from design in nature. Thomas Aquinas gets a mention, but the sources really zeroes in on William Paley.
Paley. 1802, the watchmaker analogy. Everyone knows that one.
Pretty much. Find a complex watch on the ground, you assume there's a watchmaker.
Right. So Paley said, look at the complexity of nature eyes, organisms that implies a designer too.
Exactly. Now, jump forward. The sources say modern creationism got a big boost in the 1920s in the U.S. There's this whole fundamentalist modernist fight going on.
And that's when creation science really emerged, using that design argument.
Yeah, often leaning heavily on it to explain biological complexity. But then they ran into trouble trying to get it taught in public schools.
Because the courts stepped in. Rulings came down saying, look, this is religious teaching. You can't mandate it in science clash under the Constitution.
Precisely. And this is where, according to the sources, it gets really, really interesting. There was a big Supreme Court case in 1987, Edwards v. Aguillard.
That's the one that barred teaching creation science.
Correct. And right after that decision, something happened with a high school biology textbook manuscript of pandas and people.
Okay, what happened?
The sources point to drafts from 1987, just after Edwards. And they show hundreds, literally hundreds of instances of creation science or creationism being swapped out.
Swapped out for what?
For intelligent design.
Whoa. Seriously, hundreds of times.
That's the source's detail. And there was even this like Freudian slip of a typo.
The typo.
Yeah, where creationists was supposed to be changed, but it accidentally came out as see design proponentsists.
See design proponentsists, wow.
Kind of gives the game away, doesn't it? The sources present this as pretty solid evidence that intelligent design wasn't some brand new idea, but a new label.
A label specifically chosen to get around the legal problems that creation science face.
That's the argument presented. And this whole maneuver, this relabeling, is what the sources mark as the start of the modern intelligent design movement, the IDM.
And this movement, backed by places like the Discovery Institute, then started pushing hard to get ID taught in schools.
Yep, which, down the road, led directly to that big court case in 2005, Kitzmiller v. Dover. We'll definitely get back to that one.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now let's unpack the actual core concepts. What are the main arguments ID makes, according to these sources?
The material really focuses on two big ones, irreducible complexity and specified complexity.
All right. Irreducible complexity first, popularized by Michael Behe, the biochemist, in his book, Darwin's Black Box.
That's the one from '96, though the sources mention he actually described it earlier in the '93 edition of that Pandas textbook.
So what is it exactly?
Pegue's definition is basically a system with several interacting parts, and if you remove even one of those parts, the whole system just stops working. Completely ceases function.
Like the mousetrap analogy they always use.
Exactly. The sources bring that up. You need the base, the spring, the hammer, the hold-down bar, the catch. Take any one piece away, and it's not a mousetrap anymore. It doesn't work.
And the ID claim, based on this, is that something like natural selection couldn't build such a system step by step, because the function isn't there until all the pieces are present.
That's the core of the argument. They say gradual evolution can't account for it. Behe used biological examples. The bacterial flagellum is a famous one, the blood clotting cascade, cilia, the immune system.
Okay, but the sources immediately bring up criticisms, right?
Oh yeah, big time. Critics argue that this whole idea assumes the parts always had their current role and were always necessary.
Which might not be true in evolution.
Right. Evolution can co-opt parts that had different functions before or modify things, use temporary scaffolding that gets removed later. Critics even point out that, hey, you can actually simplify a mousetrap and it might still function, maybe just not as well.
And the sources also mention Behe himself admitting some issues.
Yeah, acknowledging his prose was maybe sloppy, and that the argument wasn't like a formal logical proof.
More importantly, didn't the Kitzmiller court address this directly?
It did. The sources say the court found Behe's specific claims about irreducible complexity, particularly regarding the flagellum and immune system, were refuted by peer-reviewed scientific research presented during the trial.
Okay, so that's irreducible complexity. What's the second main concept?
Specified complexity. This one's associated mainly with William Dembski, a mathematician. He built on some earlier ideas using information theory, particularly related to DNA.
Specified complexity, how does that work?
Dembski's argument is that it's not enough for something to just be complex, like, say, a random string of letters. It also has to be specified,
Meaning?
meaning it matches some independent pattern or has some discernible meaning. So random letters, complex maybe, but not specified. A simple repeating pattern like AAA is specified maybe, but not complex.
But a line of Shakespeare.
Exactly. That's both complex and specified. It fits a pattern, language, meaning. Dembski calls this combination complex specified information, or CSI.
And his claim is, what if something has CSI?
His claim, as laid out in the sources, is that if something exhibits CSI and he sets a very high bar, a probability threshold of less than 1 in 10 to the 150t of occurring by chance, then it cannot be explained by natural processes alone. It must be the result of an intelligent cause.
Okay, I see the argument. But the critics?
They jump all over this too. The sources say critics argue it's basically tautological.
Meaning it's a circular argument.
Kind of. They say Dembski defines CSI in such a way that natural processes can't produce it by definition, and then concludes that anything with CSI must be designed. It defines the conclusion.
What else do critics say?
Well, the sources note that the scientific and mathematical communities largely discredit the soundness of his calculations and framework. His method, the explanatory filter, is also criticized.
The filter.
Yeah, it works by elimination. Does it happen regularly? No. Does it happen by chance? No. Okay, then it must be design. Critics say this just defaults to design whenever we lack a full natural explanation, which could lead to wrong conclusions.
And didn't Richard Dawkins have something to say about this? That idea of needing a designer?
Right, the sources mention Dawkins' point. If you need a designer to explain complexity, then the designer itself must be incredibly complex. So what designed the designer? It just pushes the problem back.
The sources also briefly mention the fine-tuned universe argument, right?
Yeah, that comes up. The idea that physical constants, gravity, electromagnetism, etc., seem perfectly dialed in for life to exist. ID proponents point to this as evidence for a designer, not just chance.
And the counter-arguments.
Similar themes. Critics call it a tautology. Of course, the universe supports life, otherwise we wouldn't be here to observe it. It's an observational bias.
And maybe other kinds of life are possible under different conditions.
Exactly. An argument from lack of imagination, some say. Plus, maybe those constants aren't independent. Maybe they're linked in ways we don't understand yet, making a universe like ours more probable than it seems.
Okay, this leads to a big question. Who or what is the intelligent designer? What do the sources say about how ID proponents address this?
This is a really key point in the sources. Publicly, especially in scientific or secular contexts, ID proponents are usually very careful not to identify the designer. They keep it vague.
But privately or to certain audiences?
That's where it changes. The sources cite leading figures like Philip Johnson, William Dembski, Stephen Meyer, explicitly telling Christian supporters that the designer is the Christian God.
So, a different message depending on the audience.
Seems so. They apparently even connect ID concepts to things like the logos in the Gospel of John and talk about ID paving the way for people to come to Christ.
And how is this viewed by critics or observers?
Well, Barbara Forrest, who studied the movement and testified at the Kitzmiller trial, is cited in the sources calling this deliberate ambiguity. Intentional obfuscation, basically.
And the Kitzmiller judge agreed with that assessment.
Yes. Judge Jones's ruling, based on the evidence presented, concluded that the attempt to avoid naming the designer was a strategic move, not a genuine scientific uncertainty. It was about repackaging a religious concept.
Have they ever suggested other designers? Like aliens?
The sources mention proponents sometimes speculating about things like alien cultures, or using the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, as an analogy. But Dembski, for example, is quoted concluding that no physical agent within the universe could be responsible for originating the universe or life itself. So it points beyond the physical.
This raises another issue critics bring up, according to the sources. Instances of apparent poor design in nature.
Right. If there's this super intelligent designer, why do we see things that seem, well, suboptimal?
Like what?
The sources mention examples like the vitamin C pseudogene in humans. We have the gene, but it's broken, doesn't work, so we need vitamin C in our diet, unlike most mammals. Or the way nerves and tubes are routed in bodies sometimes seems inefficient. Island biogeography patterns look more like evolution and migration than deliberate placement.
How do ID proponents respond to that?
The sources outline a few responses. One is basically, we don't know the designer's motives. Maybe what looks like poor design to us serves some other purpose we can't grasp.
Or maybe the designer wasn't aiming for perfect engineering.
That's another line associated with Behe in the Kitzmiller trial testimony. Maybe optimality wasn't the goal. But critics point out this makes ID unfalsifiable. You can explain away any observation by just saying, the designer must have had a reason.
And the sources mention Philip Johnson suggesting a specific, non-testable motive for AIDS.
Yes, that's cited suggesting it was created to punish immorality. Clearly, as the sources note, that's not a scientifically testable hypothesis.
Which brings us back to that question, what designed the designer?
Yeah, the ultimate regression problem. The sources say ID proponents tend to dismiss this question as irrelevant or outside the scope of ID. They just focus on detecting design in nature.
But critics
see it as a fundamental flaw. If your explanation for complexity requires an even greater complexity that itself is unexplained, you haven't really explained anything. Dawkins famously called dismissing this question a thought-terminating cliché.
Okay, let's shift to the movement itself, the Intelligent Design Movement, or IDM. The sources describe it as basically growing out of creationism in the 80s.
Directly. Sometimes it's even called intelligent design creationism. The connection is very strong, according to the material.
And it's centered at the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture.
That's its main institutional home, yeah. Founded in Seattle in 1996. And the sources cite their own documents, like the Wedge Strategy document.
The Wedge Strategy, what's that?
According to the sources, it outlines a goal to reverse the stifling dominance of the materialist worldview in science and society and replace it with a science consonant with Christian and theistic convictions. It's about driving a wedge into scientific materialism.
And this reinforces that idea of a dual message we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. The sources emphasize how leaders like Johnson and Dembski use careful, secular-sounding language in public debates or scientific contexts.
But behind closed doors, or to Christian supporters.
They're much more explicit about the designer being the Christian God, linking ID to theology, and stating the ultimate goal is evangelistic, using ID as a tool to bring people to Christianity. Barbara Forrest's analysis, cited in the sources, really hits on this as intentional obfuscation.
Interesting. Do all creationists support ID, though?
Actually, no. The sources point out that some more traditional Bible literalist creationist groups, like the Institute for Creation Research or Answers in Genesis, are critical of ID.
Why?
Because it's not explicitly biblical enough for them. It doesn't insist on a young earth or directly reference Genesis, for example. They see it as potentially compromising.
Okay, now the big one. How does the established scientific community view intelligent design based on these sources?
It's pretty brutal. The consensus reported is overwhelming and unambiguous. Intelligent design is not science, period.
Who says this?
Major scientific organizations, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, the National Science Teaching Association, NSTA. Numerous prominent bodies have issued statements calling it pseudoscience.
Why the strong rejection? What makes it not science, in their view?
The sources lay out the standard criteria for scientific theories. Things like being consistent, useful for further research, based on observation, testable, falsifiable, correctable, progressive.
And ID fails these tests.
According to the scientific bodies cited, yes, it fails most, if not all. Fundamentally, it tries to overturn methodological naturalism,
Which is?
the basic ground rule of science, seeking natural explanations for natural phenomena. ID explicitly wants to allow supernatural explanations, which science, by its nature, generally doesn't deal with because they can't be empirically tested.
What about publishing? Do ID proponents publish research supporting their claims?
That's another key point in the sources. There's a noted lack of peer-reviewed papers supporting core ID claims published in mainstream scientific journals.
They have their own journals, though.
They do, but critics cited in the sources argue these lack genuine, impartial peer review because the reviewers and editors are largely ID proponents themselves, so it's seen as an echo chamber.
The sources also mention ID relies on arguments from ignorance.
Yes, that's a frequent criticism. The structure is often, science can't fully explain phenomenon X yet with natural causes, therefore it must have been designed.
That sounds like the God of the gaps idea.
Exactly. Filling a gap in current scientific knowledge with a supernatural and ultimately untestable explanation. It also sets up that false dichotomy we mentioned earlier.
The idea that if evolution has any unanswered questions, ID must be true.
Right. It's framed as an either-or choice. This contrived dualism was specifically rejected by the court back in the 1982 McLean v. Arkansas creation science trial, and the sources draw that parallel.
And this leads to the Discovery Institute's big public strategy. Teach the controversy.
Yep. The sources describe this campaign as pushing schools to present ID alongside evolution, claiming there's a genuine scientific debate about evolution's validity that students need to hear.
But the scientific community's response is
That the controversy is purely political and religious, not scientific. Within the actual field of biology, the sources state, there is no significant scientific controversy about the validity of evolution.
Which brings us neatly to the legal side of things. The sources really focus on that Kitzmiller v. Dover case from 2005.
That was the landmark trial in the U.S. Parents in Dover, Pennsylvania, sued their local school district.
Why? What was the district doing?
They had implemented a policy requiring science teachers to read a statement to students suggesting that evolution is flawed and presenting intelligent design as an alternative scientific theory.
And the parents argued.
They argued, successfully, that ID was just creationism rebranded, and therefore teaching it or promoting it in public school science classes violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment.
The separation of church and state.
Correct. And Judge Johnny Jones III presided. His decision, detailed extensively in the sources, was a sweeping rejection of ID.
What did he rule specifically?
He ruled unequivocally that intelligent design is not science. He stated it cannot uncouple itself from its creationist and thus religious antecedents. Therefore, promoting it in public schools was unconstitutional.
Wow, pretty definitive.
Absolutely. And he had some harsh words for the teach the controversy strategy, too. The sources quote him calling it, at best, disingenuous, and at worst, a canard.
A canard, like a false story.
Essentially, yeah. He concluded its real goal wasn't to improve science education or encourage critical thinking, but specifically to promote religion by undermining evolution.
What happened after the ruling? Did the school district appeal?
Interestingly, no. The sources mentioned that in the next election, the school board members who had supported the ID policy were all voted out of office. The new board chose not to appeal the decision.
So the Kitzmiller ruling stands as strong precedent.
Very much so, particularly regarding ID in U.S. public schools.
Are there still efforts to get ID or similar ideas into schools?
The sources mention ongoing legislative efforts in various states, often disguised as academic freedom bills. These bills frequently use language drafted or promoted by the Discovery Institute.
But critics argue these are still trying to sneak religion or pseudoscience into science class.
That's the criticism highlighted, yes.
Yeah.
That they lack credible scientific basis and are aimed at weakening evolution education. The sources even mention the American Academy of Religion, suggesting that if ID is taught, it belongs in religion or social studies classes, not science.
Okay, what about outside the U.S.? What's the international status, according to the sources?
Europe seems to have taken a pretty firm stance. The sources highlight a Council of Europe report and resolution.
What did it say?
It called ID a form of creationism, labeled it anti-science and intellectual deception, and strongly recommended that it should not be taught as science in European schools, although discussing it in religion class might be appropriate.
Any specific countries mentioned?
Similar positions against teaching ID as science are noted for the UK, the Netherlands, and Belgium.
And does ID resonate with any other religious groups beyond Christianity?
The sources touch on this briefly. There's mention of ID ideas being discussed or promoted among some Muslim communities, particularly in Turkey, citing figures like Muzaffar Iqbal.
And Hindus?
Yes. Also a mention of groups like ISK-Khan, the Hare Krishna movement, featuring ID proponents in publications like their book Rethinking Darwin. So it's not exclusively a Christian phenomenon, though its origins and main push are rooted there, according to the sources.
Right. So quite a journey through this material.
Definitely. We've covered a lot, tracing ID from its roots in theology and the paley argument.
Through the whole creation science phase and the legal battles that led to the intelligent design rebranding.
Unpacking those core concepts like irreducible complexity and specified complexity, and the significant scientific pushback against them.
Looking at the movement itself, the Discovery Institute, the wedge strategy, that dual messaging.
The overwhelming scientific consensus that it's pseudoscience, the legal verdict in Kitzmiller.
And its status internationally and connections to other faiths, all based just on what was in the sources you provided.
Yeah, it paints a pretty detailed picture of ID as presented in this material, its arguments, its history, its goals, and the controversy surrounding it.
It definitely gives you, the listener, a solid foundation built entirely from the source documents we had to work with.
Absolutely.
So, reflecting on everything we've just discussed, pulled directly from these sources, the clear debate about whether ID qualifies as science or is fundamentally religious, the major legal challenges tied to church-state separation in the U.S., the very deliberate strategies used by proponents like teach the controversy, here's something to maybe chew on.
What's that?
What does this whole story, as told by these sources, suggest to you about how we draw lines, or maybe how we fight over drawing lines between science, religion, and public life, especially in education and the courts? How are those boundaries constantly being negotiated?
Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive today into, well, one of the world's most iconic and complex geopolitical features, the border between India and Pakistan.
Yeah, it really is. And we've got our source material here, mostly an excerpt from Wikipedia, which should help us navigate this pretty fascinating line on the map.
Right. Our mission really is to pull out the most important nuggets from this source, trying to understand the different bits of this border, its physical nature, and, even some of the unique human stuff that happens along it.
And it definitely has a reputation. The source points out it's ranked as one of the most dangerous international boundaries anywhere in the world.
And here's a really interesting bit. The source says you can actually see it clearly from space at night.
That's right. Apparently, due to this massive lighting project by India, the source mentions something like 150,000 floodlights on around 50,000 poles.
Wow, that many.
Yeah. That level of illumination, it really says something about the security focus, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. So the source tells us the border itself is 3,323 kilometers long. That's just over 2,000 miles.
And established right after the partition of India back in 1947.
Yeah. And it cuts through just incredibly diverse landscapes. You've got urban areas, then these really harsh, inhospitable deserts. It's amazing one line covers all that.
And that's a really key point, It's not just one single uniform line. The source actually breaks it down into several distinct sections. Maybe we can sort of travel along it north to south.
Sounds good. So way up north, in the freezing bits, we start with the actual ground position line, the AGPO. The source explains this is what separates the Indian and Pakistani military posts up in the Siachen Glacier region, which is, of course, heavily disputed.
And the source really emphasizes the conditions there, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It runs along the Saltoro Mountains, peaks over 7,000 meters. That's, 23,000 feet?
Yeah.
And temperatures can drop to around minus 55 degrees Celsius. That's minus 67 Fahrenheit. Unbelievable. So it's not just a line on paper. It's defined by these incredibly harsh, high-altitude military positions.
Exactly. The source says it starts from the northernmost point of the line of control, we'll get to that, and ends near the tri-point where India, China, and Pakistan kind of meet.
And interestingly, the source notes India gained control of about 1,000 square miles of disputed land up there back in 1984.
Right, in that brutal environment. Which really just highlights the strategic importance, I suppose, and maybe the human cost of holding ground in a place like that.
Definitely makes you think. Okay, so moving south from that icy, very active military line, we hit the line of control, the Law Sea.
Yes, and this separates the disputed areas administered by India, places like parts of Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir, from the areas administered by Pakistan.
But the source is very clear here.
It is. The Law Sea is not part of the internationally recognized border. It exists purely because of the Kashmir conflict. It was demarcated after the Simla Agreement in 1972, basically updating an older UN ceasefire line from the 47 war. So it's a de facto military line, you see, not a settled international boundary.
Got it. So below the disputed Law Sea, next comes the working boundary, the WB.
That's right. The source describes this as separating another disputed section of Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir, this time from Pakistani Punjab.
And the distinction here sounds subtle but important.
It is crucial, as the source points out. The UN calls it a working boundary. India, however, regards it as the international border.
Why the difference?
Well, the key is that Pakistani Punjab is internationally recognized as part of Pakistan by both sides. But Jammu and Kashmir, as we said, remains disputed. So the name itself, working boundary, reflects that ongoing political complexity.
Right, okay. That makes sense. And then finally we get to the part that is internationally recognized by both countries. The international boundary, or IB.
Often called the Radcliffe Line.
Yeah. That's the one.
Exactly. The source clarifies this is the officially demarcated line from the 1947 partition. It runs from Punjab down through Rajasthan and Sindh into Gujarat. This is the bit where both countries formally agree, okay, this is the line.
But even then, right at the southern end, in the Rite of Kutch, there's still a bit of contention. Sir Creek.
Yeah, another complexity. The source describes Sir Creek as a tidal estuary, separates southern Gujarat in India from southern Sindh in Pakistan.
And the issue is?
Well, while the boundary eastward from a certain point was fixed by a tribunal award back in '68, the source points out there's still a dispute over the exact line within the creek itself. So, yeah, the disagreements literally go right down to the water.
It's just fascinating how one border can have all these different sections with completely different statuses. Active military lines, recognized borders, disputed water.
It really is something. And given all that complexity and the security concerns we mentioned, it's probably not a huge surprise to hear about the physical barrier they've built.
Right. The source states that out of that total 3,323 kilometers length, India had fenced a pretty significant chunk, 2,064 kilometers by 2024.
That's, what, over 60% fence then? But the source also explains that, well, you can't fence everywhere.
Makes sense.
Yeah, the remaining 916 kilometers are covered by other barriers, physical and non-physical, because the terrain just makes fencing impossible. You know, dense forests, really rugged mountains, rivers, marshes.
You have to adapt the security to the actual ground.
Precisely. And talking about infrastructure, the source highlights something pretty recent and significant. India started building a 1,450-kilometer-long border road in February 2025.
A road along the barrier.
Yeah, specifically along parts in Punjab and Rajasthan.
And the purpose?
Well, the source tells us it's about enabling swifter access for their forces, obviously, strengthening patrols against drugs and terrorism, and also acting as an anti-tunnel measure.
Ah, okay. So it's not just a fence, it's about creating a whole security system around it, a tangible effort to control movement.
Definitely. But despite being called one of the world's most dangerous borders and having all these barriers, there are still points where interaction and crossing happen, under strict conditions, of course.
Right. The source lists several designated crossing points. Customs, immigration, the whole setup. The most famous one, probably, is Atari and Wagah, near Amritsar and Lahore.
That's the one known globally for the border ceremony.
And there's a newer crossing mentioned, the Kartarpur Corridor.
Yes, that one's interesting. It serves a very specific purpose. Pilgrims from India going to the Gurdwara Darbar Sahib Kartarpur in Pakistan. You need a special electronic authorization for it. It's basically a corridor just for religious passage.
Okay. Any others?
The source mentions Munabao in Rajasthan. It has a railway station used by the Thar Express train, though its history is a bit stop-start.
How so?
Closed after the '65 war, reopened in 2006, but then closed again in 2019. So even the crossing points reflect the ups and downs of the relationship.
True. The source also lists a few others. Ganda Singh, Wallahu Saniwala, Sulamanki Fazilka. And one that's closed now, Longdwala. So these specific controlled valves exist.
But the human element, that really comes alive when the source talks about the border ceremonies, these beating retreat flag ceremonies.
Held jointly.
Yes, jointly every evening around sunset. And they're actually open to the public, tourist attractions, basically. No special permit needed.
And the Atari Wagah one is the big one. The source's description is quite vivid.
It really is. Involves India's border security force, the BSF, and the Pakistan Rangers. Apparently it starts with loud screaming battle calls from both sides.
Seriously?
Screaming.
That's what the source says.
Followed by, and I quote, organized high kicks, stomps, and dance moves. And during this, the troops actively stare each other down. It sounds less like a normal military drill and more like, well, a performance, a symbolic showdown.
Organized high kicks.
Yeah.
That paints quite a picture. This intense, almost theatrical display of nationalism and rivalry played out right there.
But then the source adds another layer. It says the whole thing ends with a handshake between the head guards, and they lower the flags together.
A handshake after all that.
Yeah. Symbolizing, as the source puts it, both the brotherhood and the rivalry they share. It even mentions that troops sometimes exchange sweets during holidays, like Eid and Diwali.
That contrast is really striking. The aggressive performance, then a handshake, even exchanging sweets sometimes.
It is. But the source also includes that stark reminder of the danger. It factually notes the 2014 suicide attack right there at Wagah killed 60 people.
Right, grounding the spectacle in the very real risks of that border.
Exactly. And the source mentions other ceremony sites too, like Husainiwala Ganda Singh Wala and Siddiqui Sulamanki, and even touches on a traditional celebration near Ramgarh, the Baba Chamalial Mela, where people from both sides actually participate.
So you get these moments of intense, almost performative rivalry, right alongside instances of shared culture or simple courtesies. It really shows the complex, layered reality of life along that line.
It's definitely not just a physical barrier. It feels like a dynamic space, reflecting history, conflict, and even these shared traditions somehow.
So, wrapping this up, what does it all mean? This deep dive, using our source, reveals this incredibly complex line, marked by partition history, ongoing conflict seen in those distinct sections,
Huge security features like the floodlights and the fencing.
and the surprisingly unique human rituals like those border ceremonies. It's quite a mix.
It really is. It's a border that's, segmented by different political statuses, secured by massive infrastructure, yet punctuated by these controlled crossing points and moments of human interaction, both tense and sometimes cooperative.
And why should you, listening, care about this specific line on a map? Well, understanding it gives you a real insight into how big historical events literally shape the ground beneath our feet.
And how technology is used for national security on such a massive scale. And maybe most interestingly, how even in areas defined by so much tension, these unique cultural practices and shared moments can still emerge.
Absolutely. Which leads to maybe a final thought for you to consider. This complex, highly watched, and sometimes, as we've seen, highly performative boundary. How does that very visibility, that theatricality, especially at places like Wagah, actually influence the relationship and the perceptions between the people on either side? How does that compare, perhaps, to international borders that are much quieter, much less visible?
That's a really interesting question to ponder. The impact of making a border a spectacle. Okay, let's dive way, way out there. We're talking the absolute edge of the solar system, a place that was once just a whisper of an idea, filled with icy bodies we could barely imagine.
It really was. Just this vast, mysterious region.
And today we're taking a deep dive into that region, the Kuiper Belt.
It's a truly fascinating frontier, stretching far beyond the familiar path of the planets. Think of it as a vast, cold disk of leftovers.
Leftovers from when the solar system was forming.
Exactly, from that chaotic time.
So our mission today is to unpack the source material you've shared, this detailed look at the Kuiper Belt, and really pull out the key stuff, the important insights, the surprising facts.
Yeah, the things that help make sense of it all.
So that by the end of this deep dive, you can feel, genuinely well-informed about what's going on out there.
We'll cover what it is, how we even figured it out, what kind of strange things live there.
And what they're made of, too, right?
Definitely. Composition is key.
Perfect. So let's start with the absolute basics. If someone just asked, what is the Kuiper Belt? What's the quick answer?
At its simplest, it's this huge disc-shaped region, way out in the outer solar system.
Okay. Where exactly?
It starts right after Neptune's orbit, around 30 astronomical units from the sun.
30 AU, so 30 times Earth's distance from the sun.
Right, and it extends outwards to about 50 AU.
Okay, so it's kind of like the asteroid belt we have between Mars and Jupiter, but just much, much farther out. Is that a fair comparison?
It's helpful, yeah, as a starting point.
Yeah.
But the scale difference is just huge.
How huge?
Well, the Kuiper Belt is roughly 20 times wider than the asteroid belt. And mass-wise, estimates are anywhere from maybe 20 to possibly even 200 times more massive.
Whoa, okay, so much bigger.
Much bigger. Both are leftover building blocks, sure, but their composition tells a totally different story because of where they are.
Because it's just so incredibly cold out there.
Precisely. We're talking temperatures around 50 Kelvin. Absolute zero is 0 Kelvin, so it's incredibly cold. Things we think of as gases or liquids here, methane, ammonia, water, they're all solid ice out there.
Right, frozen solid.
So the asteroid belt is mostly rock and metal. The Kuiper Belt objects, they're primarily these ices mixed in with some rock.
Icy leftovers, got it. And what kind of stuff lives out there? Is it just small chunks of ice floating around?
Well, it's populated by a huge number of these small bodies, yeah, planetesimals that just didn't grow into full planets.
Okay.
But importantly, it's also home to most of the objects we now classify as dwarf planets.
Ah, like Pluto, the most famous resident.
Exactly. Pluto's the biggest and most massive known object actually in the Kuiper Belt.
Yeah.
But there are others accepted as dwarf planets too.
Like who?
Orcus, Haumea, Quaoar, and Makemake. Those are the main ones.
Huh. And you mentioned something else interesting. Moons.
Yeah, this is really cool. Some moons orbiting the giant planets are thought to have actually started life out of the Kuiper Belt. Neptune's biggest moon, Triton, is the prime example.
Triton came from the Kuiper Belt. How do we know?
Well, we'll get into Triton more later, but its weird orbit is a big clue.
Yeah.
And maybe even Saturn's moon Phoebe originated out there too, before being captured.
Wow. So it's not this empty, boring place at all. It's got small chunks, dwarf planets, maybe even the origin point for some major moons.
It's a dynamic and diverse region, definitely.
How did we even figure out this belt might exist? I mean, it wasn't like someone just looked through a telescope and saw a giant disk.
No, not at all. It was a really slow burn, an accumulation of ideas and predictions over decades. Right after Pluto was found, back in 1930, some astronomers like Frederick Leonard and Armin Leuschner started thinking, well, maybe Pluto isn't alone out there. It seemed unlikely.
So the seed of the idea was planted early.
Sort of. Then, in the 1940s, you had Kenneth Edgeworth, a British astronomer. He proposed that the material beyond Neptune was probably too spread out, too thin, to clump together into big planets.
So it would just stay as small bodies.
Exactly. Just hang out there as a collection of small bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And he even suggested these might occasionally get nudged inwards and become comets.
Interesting. And Gerard Kuiper himself, the guy it's named after, what was his specific idea in 1951?
Well, Kuiper did speculate about a disk of remnants forming early on.
Yeah.
But here's the twist. Back then, they thought Pluto was huge, like Earth-sized.
Oh, right. That thinking changed later.
Dramatically. So Kuiper thought this massive Pluto would have gravitationally cleared out that whole region, scattering everything away. So, ironically, his hypothesis suggested such a belt might not exist today because of Pluto.
Huh. That's a fantastic bit of history. It's named after him, but he kind of argued against it existing now.
Based on the assumptions of the time, yeah. It's why the naming is sometimes debated.
So other people had the core idea earlier, or maybe saw the modern picture more clearly.
You could argue that. Al G.W. Cameron talked about a tremendous mass of small stuff out there in the 60s. Fred Whipples suggested a comet belt.
A comet belt. Why
Yeah.
comets? What was the connection there?
That became the really crucial piece of evidence. We see two main types of comets, right? Long period ones taking thousands of years to orbit, coming from the really distant Oort cloud,
Okay.
and short period comets like Halley's that whip around in less than 200 years.
And the Oort cloud couldn't explain those.
Not really. It's just too far away. The dynamics don't work well to produce those frequent, shorter orbits. They needed a closer source, a reservoir.
Ah, so enter the Kuiper Belt prediction.
Exactly. This is where it really solidified. In 1980, Julio Fernandez proposed that a belt of icy bodies located roughly between 35 and 50 AU could be the source feeding us these short-period comets.
And did the math back that up?
It did. Later computer simulations, especially by Duncan, Quinn, and Tremaine in the late 80s, strongly supported Fernandez's idea. They show that a belt, like he described, matched the observed orbits and numbers of short-period comets much, much better than relying only on the Oort cloud.
So the comet orbits were like breadcrumbs leading us to the belt.
Absolutely.
That
Which, brings us back to the naming. It's called the Kuiper Belt, but Edgeworth had an early concept. Fernandez made the key prediction based on comet dynamics.
Right.
David Jewett, who we'll talk about next, actually suggested Fernandez most nearly deserves the credit. Some people try to use Edgeworth Kuiper Belt, but, well, Kuiper Belt is what stuck, maybe because Fernandez used it in his paper title.
Names stick for funny reasons sometimes. So speaking of David Jewett, when did we finally see something in this predicted belt? Besides Pluto, obviously, which was found way back.
That was the big breakthrough moment, 1992. After 5 years of really dedicated searching, David Jewett and Jane Liu announced they'd found the first new object, something clearly part of this predicted population.
1992. That feels surprisingly recent for discovering a whole new region of the solar system, essentially.
It does, yeah. This object was initially just called 1992 QB1. It now has the official name, 45760 Albion.
Albion, okay. And how did they find it? Was it the same super painstaking process Clyde Tombaugh used for Pluto, blinking photos?
These started with similar techniques, yeah, using a blink comparator to look for tiny movements against the background stars. But the game changer was CCD technology.
Like digital cameras.
Basically, yeah. Much more sensitive to light than old photographic plates. This let them gather light way faster and use computers to blink the images digitally. It sped things up enormously.
Still took them 5 years, though.
Oh yeah, incredible dedication, just scanning patch after patch of sky looking for that one faint, slow-moving dot.
Wow. And since Albion in 92, how many have we found? Has the floodgate opened?
Completely. By 2018, we knew of thousands of these Kuiper Belt optics, or KBOs, and the estimates now suggest there are probably over 100,000 objects out there, larger than 100 kilometers across, maybe many more smaller ones.
100,000? That just completely redraws our map of the outer solar system.
It really does. And as we found more and more, it became clear the Kuiper Belt isn't just one uniform thing. It has a really complex structure.
Okay, let's get into that structure. What does it look like?
Well, the whole thing stretches from about 30 AU out to maybe 55 AU, if you include everything loosely associated.
Yeah.
But the main concentration, the sort of classical Kuiper Belt, is generally thought to be between Neptune's 2.3 orbital resonance.
Okay, what's a resonance again?
It's where an object's orbit is in a simple ratio with Neptune's orbit. So 2.3 means the object orbits the Sun twice for every 3 times Neptune orbits. That happens around 39.5 AU.
Got it. So between that 2.3 resonance
And the 1.2 resonance, which is further out, around 48 AU. That's the main chunk of the belt.
And it's not like a flat ring like Saturn's rings, right? You mentioned it's thicker.
Oh yeah, much thicker. It's more like a big puffy donut or a torus shape than a flat disk. Well, the average tilt or inclination relative to the plane of the solar system is pretty small, maybe 1.86 degrees. Now, individual objects are found quite far above and below that plane. The distribution is diffuse, spread out vertically.
And what's creating this structure, these resonances, the thickness, maybe even gaps?
Neptune. It's all about Neptune's gravity. It's the dominant gravitational influence out there, constantly tugging on these small bodies.
So those resonances are like gravitational sweet spots. Or maybe dangerous spots.
Both, actually. Resonances can stabilize orbits, locking objects into a pattern where they avoid close encounters with Neptune. But other nearby orbits can become unstable because of Neptune's influence, getting cleared out over millions of years.
Ah, so that's why you see gaps, like there's a known gap between 40 and 42 AU.
Exactly. Neptune's gravity likely destabilized orbits in that region, kicking objects out. So Neptune acts like both a shepherd, guiding things into stable resonances.
And like a bouncer clearing out the unstable
A
zones.
very powerful gravitational bouncer, yeah. And within the belt, based on how these objects orbit, we talk about different dynamical classes. It helps us sort them.
Okay, like the classical belt. Tell me about that one.
Right, so the classical belt is that core region we mentioned, mainly between the 2.3 and 1.2 resonances, roughly 42 to 48 AU. Objects here aren't locked in a strong resonance with Neptune. Their gravitational interactions happen over really long time scales, so their orbits are relatively stable, mostly unaltered by Neptune right now.
And this is where most of the KBOs we found actually live.
Yeah, about 2/3 of the known KBOs fall into this classical category. And remember Albion, 1992 QB1.
First one found.
Yeah, it's a classical KBO, which is why these objects sometimes get the informal nickname Cubanos after QB1.
Cubanos. That's catchy. Is there a theme for their official names?
Yes, the International Astronomical Union tries to name classical KBOs after mythological beings associated with creation.
Okay, cool. And you mentioned there are different types within this classical belt, something about hot and cold.
That's right. This is a really key distinction. We see two populations that seem to behave very differently orbitally. The dynamically cold population and the dynamically hot population.
Cold and hot, like temperature.
Not temperature, no. It's an analogy based on their orbital energy and movement. Think of particles in a cold gas versus a hot gas. Cold means calmer, less energetic orbits. Hot means more energetic, more chaotic orbits.
Okay, explain the cold population's orbits.
The cold population has orbits that are, well, pretty calm. They're nearly circular, so low eccentricity. And they have low inclinations, meaning they stick very close to the main plane of the solar system, the ecliptic plane, usually tilted less than 10 degrees.
So they orbit kind of like the planets do, but further out?
In a way, yeah, they're quite orderly. There's even a tighter cluster of them, a kernel, found between 44 and 44.5 AU.
And the hot population?
Very different. Their orbits are much more tilted, much higher inclinations. They can be tilted up to 30 degrees or even more relative to the ecliptic. And their orbits can be more stretched out, more eccentric, too.
So cold means low inclination, nearly circular. Hot means high inclination, maybe more eccentric.
That's the core orbital difference, yes. But it's not just their orbits that are different. These two groups seem fundamentally different in other ways, too.
Like what?
The cold objects tend to be redder in color. They're also generally brighter, have higher albedo. And interestingly, we find a much higher percentage of binary objects, two objects orbiting each other, among the cold population.
Binaries are more common in the cold group, huh?
Yeah. They also have a different size distribution. The cold population seems to lack the really large objects we see in the hot population. And overall, the hot population contains significantly more mass, maybe 30 times more mass, than the entire cold population.
Wow, they sound almost like two different belts layered on top of each other. Does this mean they formed differently or maybe came from different places?
That's the leading hypothesis, exactly. The hot population, with those tilted energetic orbits, likely formed closer to the sun, maybe mixed in with the forming giant planets. Then, during the chaotic period of planet migration, which we'll talk about, they got scattered outwards into these wilder orbits.
Okay, scattered out. And the cold ones.
The cold population, with their calm orbits, and especially those fragile binaries, which probably wouldn't survive strong gravitational encounters.
Right, they get pulled apart.
They likely formed more or less in situ, right there in the quieter region where we see them now, relatively undisturbed.
And the color difference, redder cold ones.
That could reflect different initial compositions from forming in different places, or maybe just differences in how their surfaces have aged or been processed by sunlight and radiation over billions of years. Still an active area of research.
Fascinating. Okay, so that's the classical belt with its hot and cold populations. What about those objects locked in resonance with Neptune?
Right, those are the resonant objects. Their orbits are perfectly synchronized with Neptune's gravity in those simple ratios. The most famous and most populated resonance is that 2.3 we mentioned.
Orbiting twice for every 3 Neptune orbits.
Yep, located around 39.4 AU, and objects in this resonance are called Plutinos.
Plutinos, named after Pluto because Pluto's in that resonance.
Exactly. Pluto is the prototype, the biggest Plutino. These Plutinos often have quite stretched out eccentric orbits, which is strong evidence they didn't form there. They were likely captured and pushed into these stable resonance slots by Neptune as it migrated outwards long ago.
So Neptune's move outwards kind of swept them up?
Sort of corralled them into these safe harbors. And because of the resonance, even though their stretched out orbits might technically cross Neptune's path,
they never actually get close enough to collide.
The timing is always off. The resonance protects them. And fittingly, the naming convention for Plutinos is typically underworld deities.
Nice touch. Are there other important resonances besides the Plutinos 2.3?
Oh, yes. The next significant one is the 1.2 resonance, out around 47.7 AU. Objects orbiting once for every 2 Neptune orbits. These are sometimes called Tutinos. It's more sparsely populated than the Plutinos.
The Tutinos, okay.
And there are smaller populations confirmed in other resonances too, like 3.4, 3.5, 4.7, 2.5. Plus, there are objects in a 1.1 resonance with Neptune.
1.1, meaning they orbit at the same rate as Neptune.
Exactly. These are the Neptune Trojans, orbiting ahead of or behind Neptune in its own orbit, trapped in stable gravitational points called Lagrangian points, just like Jupiter has Trojans.
So Neptune's migration didn't just populate the resonances, it also cleared out the regions between them, especially closer in, below the main classical belt.
That seems to be the case. The relative emptiness below about 39 AU, except for those resonant populations like the Plutinos, is considered pretty strong evidence that Neptune swept through that region as it moved outward, gravitationally kicking most of the original objects out.
Okay, that paints a picture of the inner structure and Neptune's role. But what about the outer edge? I think I've heard about something mysterious called the Kuiper Cliff.
Ah, yes, the Kuiper Cliff. That's one of the big outstanding puzzles of the outer solar system.
What is it exactly?
Beyond that 1.2 resonance, around 47.8 AU, the number of observed Kuiper Belt objects drops off really sharply, unexpectedly sharply. It's like the population density just falls off a cliff.
And that's not what models predicted.
Not really, no. Based on ideas about how much material was needed to form Uranus and Neptune, and how planet-forming disks should generally peter out gradually, astronomers expected the belt to continue much further, maybe with a significant population well beyond 50 AU. This sudden drop-off was, and still is, quite surprising.
Any ideas why? What could cause a cliff like that?
We don't have a definitive answer. It's still debated. Maybe there simply wasn't enough raw material that far out in the protoplanetary disk to form many large detectable objects.
Or maybe something cleared them out later?
Yeah, that's another possibility.
Yeah.
Maybe some process removed them or ground them down. One really intriguing, though speculative, idea proposed by astronomer Patrick Lykaka and others is that the gravity of an unseen large planetary object, maybe something the size of Earth or Mars orbiting way out there, could be responsible for truncating the belt, for creating that cliff edge.
Planet 9 vibes.
Sort of related to those kinds of ideas, yeah. The search for a large, distant planet is partly motivated by features like the Kuiper Cliff and other orbital oddities out there. And just to add another wrinkle, some more recent analyses suggest the edge might be even more complex, maybe resembling the outer edge of the asteroid belt, possibly with another gap way out around 72 AU, far from Neptune's resonances.
So even the outer boundary is still a mystery, maybe hinting at unknown players in the solar system. Okay, let's shift to origins. How did this belt get there in the first place?
Fundamentally, the Kuiper Belt is built from planetesimals. These are the leftover building blocks, bits of rock and ice, from that huge swirling disk of gas and dust, the protoplanetary disk, that formed our sun and planets billions of years ago.
The stuff that didn't quite make it into becoming a planet.
Exactly. These fragments just weren't incorporated into the major planets. Even the largest KBOs, like Pluto or Eris, are less than 3,000 kilometers across, much smaller than the main planets.
How did the bigger KBOs, like the dwarf planets, actually form? Was it just slow, gradual accumulation, like tiny pebbles sticking together over millions of years?
That was the classical idea, slow accretion. But studies of objects like Pluto and its moon Charon, looking at the patterns of craters on their surfaces, suggest something else might have happened for the larger objects, maybe things tens of kilometers across or bigger.
What's the alternative idea?
It seems they might have formed much more quickly, perhaps through processes like the gravitational collapse of dense clouds or streams of pebbles within the early disk. These streaming instabilities or pebble cloud collapses could form large bodies relatively fast, maybe bypassing the slow kilometer-by-kilometer growth stage.
And that might also help explain why we see so many binary objects.
Possibly, yeah. Forming two objects close together might be easier in that kind of rapid collapse scenario compared to slow accretion and later capture.
Okay, so the building blocks were there, but we already touched on how the structure we see today wasn't necessarily the original structure. The giant planets played a huge role.
A crucial role, especially Jupiter, and, as we've discussed, Neptune. Their gravitational influence profoundly sculpted the belt.
And this leads us to the famous NICE model, right? The idea that the giant planets didn't actually form where they are today.
Exactly. The NICE model, named after the city in France where it was developed, addresses a major problem. The region where Uranus and Neptune currently orbit simply didn't have enough raw material, enough density in the early solar system disk to build such massive planets in a reasonable time frame.
So where did they form?
The model proposes they formed much closer to the Sun, probably packed in more tightly with Jupiter and Saturn, in a region roughly between 5 and 15 AU.
Wow, all the giants crammed in there.
Relatively speaking, yes. Then, gravitational interactions with the vast sea of leftover planetesimals surrounding them caused them to migrate. They scattered these small bodies, and in exchange, through conservation of momentum, the planet's orbits changed.
How did they move?
Generally, Jupiter tended to scatter planetesimals inwards, causing it to migrate slightly inward. Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune tended to scatter them outwards, causing them to migrate significantly outward towards their current positions.
That sounds like a pretty dramatic rearrangement of the solar system furniture.
It was incredibly dramatic. The key trigger in many versions of the NICE model is thought to be when Jupiter and Saturn crossed a powerful orbital resonance, specifically the 1.2 resonance, Jupiter orbiting twice for every one Saturn orbit.
What did that resonance crossing do?
It powerfully destabilized the entire system. It essentially gave Uranus and Neptune a gravitational kick, flinging them outwards onto more eccentric or stretched out paths. And as they barreled outwards, they plowed directly through that primordial disk of planetesimals, the original, much more massive Kuiper Belt.
Oh, wow. So that was the main sculpting event. What happened to all those original planetesimals?
It was utter chaos, a massive scattering event. Many planetesimals were flung inward, some getting captured as moons, like maybe Triton, others hitting the inner planets, contributing to the late heavy bombardment period.
Okay.
Most were scattered outward. Some ended up in the highly elliptical orbits of the scattered disk, which we'll discuss. But the vast majority estimates are 99% or even more of the original mass were ejected entirely from the solar system, lost to interstellar space.
99%. So the Kuiper Belt we see today is just the tiny remnant, the leftovers of the leftovers.
Pretty much. And as Neptune migrated through this thinning disk, its gravity captured some of those remaining planetesimals into those stable orbital resonances, like the Plutinos. Others were scattered onto the higher inclination, slightly eccentric orbits that make up the hot classical population.
So the NICE model explains the migration, the scattering, the resonances, the hot population. Seems pretty successful.
It explains a lot, yes.
Yeah.
It was a huge leap forward in understanding solar system formation. However, the original ice model isn't perfect. It has some challenges.
Like what?
For instance, some detailed simulations based on the original model struggle to perfectly match the precise distribution of orbits we see in the classical belt today. Sometimes it predicts orbits that are, on average, a bit too eccentric, or maybe doesn't produce enough of the very highly inclined objects.
Okay, slight mismatches.
And a really critical one we touched on earlier. It has a hard time explaining the survival of those loosely bound binary objects in the cold classical belt.
Because Neptune's chaotic passage should have ripped them apart.
Exactly. The gravitational encounters predicted in the standard model are often too strong for these fragile pairs to survive. This has led some researchers to seriously consider that the cold classical belt might have formed in situ after the main migration chaos, or perhaps was pushed out very gently.
So there are modified versions of the NICE model.
Yes, there are refinements and variations. Some popular ones involve starting the solar system with 5 giant planets instead of 4, with an extra ice giant somewhere between Saturn and Uranus.
An extra ice giant, what happens to it?
In these models, the resonant interactions eventually become unstable, the ice giants scatter, and this extra one often gets flung inward by Saturn, interacts strongly with Jupiter, and then gets ejected completely from the solar system.
Kicked out.
Yeah. But its gravitational influence during this scattering process can alter the migration of the remaining planets, Uranus and Neptune, in ways that might better match the observed Kuiper Belt structure, like the inclination distribution. Some models suggest Neptune might have jumped outwards more suddenly at certain points, which could help preserve the cold belt binaries if its own orbit stayed relatively circular during the process.
It sounds incredibly complex, trying to reconstruct that ancient dance of the planets.
It is. The Kuiper Belt structure is one of our best fossil records of that violent early history, but deciphering it completely is still ongoing work.
Let's talk about what these fossil records are actually made of. What's the composition? Is it all just water ice out there?
No, it's more complex than just water ice. Their composition gives us a window into the chemistry of the early outer solar system, far from the sun's heat. Because they're so cold and distant, they're thought to be relatively pristine, less altered than asteroids or inner planets.
Holding on to the original ingredients?
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
We figure out what they're made of mostly through spectroscopy.
Right, analyzing the light reflected off their surfaces, splitting it into a rainbow.
Exactly. Different molecules and minerals absorb sunlight at very specific wavelengths, leaving dark dips or lines in the reflected spectrum. These absorption lines act like chemical fingerprints, telling us what materials are present on the surface.
And what fingerprints do we see?
Generally, it's a mix of some kind of rock, silicates, and various frozen volatiles, what we call ices. Water ice is common, but also frozen methane, like natural gas, ammonia, carbon monoxide, nitrogen, things that would be gases here on Earth.
But are solid as rock at 50 Kelvin.
Absolutely. And when we can estimate their densities, which is hard, usually requires having a moon to measure the mass. We see quite a range. Some KBOs have very low densities, less than 0.4 grams per cubic centimeter.
Less dense than water ice.
Yeah, suggesting they're highly porous, maybe like loosely packed dirty snowballs with lots of empty space inside. Others have much higher densities, up to 2.6 GC-meter, which is closer to rock. These might be mostly rock with just a thin crusted ice.
Is there a pattern? Like, are bigger ones denser?
There seems to be a trend, yes. Smaller objects tend to have lower densities, while the larger objects tend to be denser. This might be because larger objects experience more heating from radioactive decay, or perhaps collisions over billions of years preferentially stripped away the lighter, icier outer layers from larger bodies, leaving the denser rocky core more dominant. Still debated.
Okay. What about their appearance, their colors? Are they all just dark and gray from eons of space radiation?
That was one of the early surprises. When astronomers started getting better color measurements, they found a surprisingly wide range. They aren't uniform at all. Some are quite neutral gray, yes, but many are distinctly reddish.
Reddish. Why would they be red?
That was unexpected. The thinking now is that the colors reflect a diversity of surface compositions and processing. It's not just pure ices. There are likely complex organic molecules mixed in, hydrocarbons created by sunlight and cosmic rays, processing simpler ices like methane over billions of years.
Radiation cooking the surface.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
This process creates complex, dark, often reddish, tar-like substances called tholins. We see strong evidence for this on reddish KBOs, like Make.
So the initial mix of ices and how much radiation they've received determines their color.
That seems to be a major factor. While the details are complex and hard to study from Earth, smaller KBOs seem to fall into roughly two groups: relatively gray ones with low reflectivity and redder ones with higher reflectivity. Some models suggest this might depend on whether they originally incorporated ices like hydrogen sulfide, which turns very red when irradiated. Small initial differences can lead to big visual differences today.
Fascinating. What about the biggest KBOs, like Pluto and Quasar? Are their surfaces different?
Yes, the largest ones often show surfaces dominated by the more volatile ices like methane, nitrogen, and carbon monoxide.
Why those specifically?
Because these objects are just massive enough and therefore just warm enough internally that these specific ices have a moderate vapor pressure even at Kuiper Belt temperatures. This means they can sublimate turn directly from solid to gas off the surface, create a very thin temporary atmosphere, and then freeze or snow back down, constantly refreshing the surface.
So they have active surface processes.
In a very slow, cold way, yes. Which specific volatiles can be retained depends on the object's surface gravity. Bigger objects hold onto gases better, and its surface temperature. Water ice, being less volatile, is also detected on several KBOs, especially larger ones like members of the Haumea family, and objects like Huya and Varuna.
And didn't you mention something about crystalline ice?
Yes, on some mid-sized to large objects like Quasar, we've detected water ice in a crystalline form, rather than the amorphous, disordered form expected at such low temperatures. Quasar also shows ammonia hydrate.
What does crystalline ice tell us?
It might hint at relatively recent geological activity, maybe cryovolcanism, ice volcanoes, or tectonic resurfacing. The heat needed to crystallize the ice might have come from the object's interior, possibly aided by ammonia acting like antifreeze, lowering the melting point of water ice.
Wow, ice volcanoes way out there. Amazing. Let's talk about quantity. How much mass is actually in the Kuiper Belt today? We said 99% was lost, so is the remainder significant?
Well, despite its vast size, the total mass currently in the Kuiper Belt is surprisingly low, really low.
How low are we talking?
The dynamically hot population is estimated to contain maybe around 1% of the mass of the Earth, and the cold population is even less massive, perhaps only 0.03% of Earth's mass. That's just 31/100ths of 1%.
Tiny.
Yeah. A more recent estimate looking at the belt's subtle gravitational influence on the planets puts the total mass at maybe only 0.02 Earth masses combined.
2% of 1% of Earth's mass spread over that enormous volume. That sounds incredibly sparse.
It is, and this leads to what astronomers call the mass problem, especially for the cold classical belt.
What's the problem?
If the cold belt was always this sparse, this low mass, then standard models of planet formation through slow accretion, small things colliding and sticking together just don't work. There wouldn't have been enough collisions, enough material close enough together to build objects larger than maybe 100 kilometers or so within the age of the solar system.
So you couldn't grow Pluto-sized things in the cold belt if it was always this empty.
It's extremely difficult, bordering on impossible with standard accretion. Furthermore, the current orbits in the belt, even the cold ones, are still energetic enough that collisions today are more likely to be destructive, smashing objects apart, rather than constructive, building them up.
So accretion doesn't work well now either.
Right. And trying to argue that the belt started massive and then lost 99.9% of its mass after forming large objects also runs into problems. Neptune's current gravitational influence probably isn't strong enough to clear out that much mass from the stable cold belt region. And trying to grind everything down through collisions would likely have destroyed all those fragile binary systems we see in the cold belt.
So the low mass pushes us back towards those alternative formation ideas, like the rapid collapse of pebble clouds.
Exactly. It strongly supports the idea that the larger objects, at least in the cold belt, must have formed more directly and quickly, perhaps via mechanisms like streaming instabilities or pebble cloud collapse, which can bypass the slow accretion bottleneck in a low-mass environment.
So the low mass itself is a huge clue about formation. What about the distribution of sizes? Are there like loads of tiny objects for every big one? Is it a smooth distribution?
The size distribution generally follows what we call power laws, basically, mathematical relationships describing how the number of objects changes with their size. But it's not a single, simple power law across all sizes or populations.
How does it vary?
Well, the hot population and the cold population show different power law slopes, meaning the ratio of large objects to small objects is different between them. And the slope often changes around a certain size, typically somewhere in the 110, 140 kilometer diameter range. The cold population, for instance, seems to have a much steeper drop-off in the number of large objects compared to the hot population.
Okay, different slopes for hot and cold. Anything else unusual?
One really significant finding, or potential finding, relates to the very small objects, things smaller than maybe a kilometer across. These are far too faint to see directly, even with Hubble.
So how do we know anything about them?
We detect them indirectly, through stellar occultations. That's when, by pure chance, one of these tiny objects passes directly between us and a distant star, causing the starlight to briefly blink out or dim.
Like a mini eclipse by a KBO.
Exactly. By monitoring lots of stars and looking for these brief blinks, astronomers can estimate how many objects of different small sizes are out there.
And what have these occultation studies found?
Several studies, like those led by Schlichting and colleagues, have found fewer of these sub-kilometer-sized objects than you would expect if you just extrapolated the size distribution downwards from the larger known KBOs.
So a deficit of the really small stuff, below about 90 kilometers you mentioned.
Yeah, the data suggests the number of objects doesn't keep increasing as rapidly as you go to smaller sizes, below roughly 90 kilometers compared to how it behaves at larger sizes. It's like the production or survival of very small fragments is less efficient than we thought.
Huh, another puzzle. Fewer small icy chunks than expected.
Potentially. And to make it even weirder, the dust detector on the New Horizons spacecraft, as it flew out through the Kuiper Belt beyond Pluto, actually detected more tiny dust particles, microscopic grains, than our current models based on collisions between larger KBOs would predict.
Wait, fewer small KBOs but more dust? How does that work?
That's the question. It's not easily explained by current models of how the belt evolves collisionally. It suggests there's still something fundamental we don't understand about the population down at the smallest scales, both the small KBOs and the dust they generate.
It really sounds like the Kuiper Belt is just full of surprises, from the biggest dwarf planets down to the tiniest dust grains.
It absolutely is. Every time we look closer, we find more complexity.
Okay, before we talk about actually visiting the belt with spacecraft, let's clarify something related you mentioned earlier, the scattered disk. How does that fit into the picture with the Kuiper Belt? Are they the same thing?
They're closely related, but dynamically distinct. Think of the scattered disk objects, SDOs, as the Kuiper Belt's wilder, more unruly cousins.
Yeah.
The scattered disk region overlaps with the Kuiper Belt, but it extends much, much farther out, sometimes well beyond 100 AU, even thousands of AU in some models. The key difference is their orbits. SDO orbits are typically very elliptical or stretched out and often highly inclined, tilted way off the main plane of the solar system.
Much more chaotic orbits than the classical KBOs or even the resonant ones.
Much more chaotic and, importantly, unstable over long timescales. Their orbits are still being actively perturbed by Neptune.
And where did they come from? Did they form out there?
The leading theory is no, they didn't form way out there. They originated in the same primordial disk as the KBOs, closer in. But during that chaotic period of Neptune's migration outwards,
They got scattered.
exactly. While some objects were nudged into the relatively stable orbits of the main Kuiper Belt, classical or resonant, others were flung outwards much more violently by Neptune's gravity, ending up on these unstable, far-reaching scattered disk orbits.
Ah, so they're another direct product of that planetary migration chaos.
Precisely. And the scattered disk is now considered the primary source, the main reservoir, for the short-period comets we see.
Because their unstable orbits eventually wander inwards.
Yes. Over millions of years, the gravitational nudges from Neptune cause the orbits of SDOs to evolve. Some get nudged onto paths that nip them closer into the realm of the giant planets. When they cross Neptune's orbit coming inwards, we often classify them as centaurs.
Centaurs, like the mythological creatures.
Yeah, named because they have characteristics of both asteroids and comets. They occupy the region between Jupiter and Neptune. And centaurs themselves are dynamically unstable. Their orbits only last a few million years before they likely collide with a planet, get ejected, or evolve further inward to become active short-period comets.
So scattered disk objects, Centaur's short-period comets. That's the pipeline.
That's the dominant pathway we understand today. The scattered disk constantly feeds the Centaur population, which in turn feeds the short-period comet population.
Got it. Now, you mentioned earlier there's sometimes fuzzy terminology between KBOs and SDOs.
Yes, it can be a bit confusing because the usage isn't always consistent in the scientific literature. Officially, the Minor Planet Center, the body that catalogs these things, tries to maintain a distinction. KBOs are objects within the main belt region, classical or resonant, roughly 30-50 AU, while SDOs are those on the more eccentric, higher inclination orbits that go much further out.
But scientists don't always stick to that.
Some scientists tend to use the term KBO more broadly, almost as a synonym for any icy trans-Neptunian object, TNO, basically anything orbiting beyond Neptune. So you'll sometimes hear objects like Eris, which technically has a scattered disk orbit. It goes way out and is highly inclined.
Eris, the dwarf planet that's more massive than Pluto.
That's the one. Technically, it's an SDO, but it's often still referred to informally as a KBO or a dwarf planet in the Kuiper Belt region, even though its orbit takes it far beyond the classical belt. It's just an unresolved terminology issue.
Okay, good to know. And just to be clear, centaurs are also considered scattered objects, just scattered inward instead of outward.
That's a good way to think about it, yes. They originated in the same outer reservoir, primordial disk-scattered disk, but ended up on unstable paths between the giant planets. Because their orbits are so unstable, they have short lifetimes, dynamically speaking, so the centaur population must be constantly replenished from that outer source, the scattered disk.
Right, so the Kuiper Belt and the scattered disk are really twin outcomes of Neptune's wild youth. Let's highlight some of the stars of this outer region, some of the most famous or notable objects. We absolutely have to start with Neptune's big moon, Triton. You teased it earlier.
Triton is fascinating. As you said, it's Neptune's largest moon, by far. And the really striking thing is its orbit. It orbits Neptune backwards compared to Neptune's own rotation.
A retrograde orbit. And that's the dead giveaway. It wasn't formed there.
It's the strongest piece of evidence, yes. Moons that form in a disk around their planet almost always orbit in the same direction the planet spins. A retrograde orbit strongly suggests capture this. Triton was a fully formed object wandering through the solar system that got gravitationally snagged by Neptune.
How does a planet even capture a moon that big? Wouldn't it just fly by?
It's actually very difficult dynamically for a single planet to capture a large satellite. The object needs some way to lose energy to settle into orbit. The leading hypothesis for Triton is that it wasn't alone when it encountered Neptune. It was likely part of a binary system.
Like those binary KBOs we talked about being common?
Exactly. If a binary KBO pair flew close to Neptune, Neptune could have captured one member, Triton, while the gravitational interaction ejected the other member from the system, carrying away the excess energy. That makes the capture dynamically feasible.
Wow. And other evidence points to Triton being a KBO.
Yes. Its size is very similar to Pluto, only about 14% larger. And critically, its surface composition, which we can study with spectroscopy, is remarkably similar to Pluto's. It's rich in frozen nitrogen, methane, carbon monoxide, the kinds of ices we see dominating the surfaces of large KBOs. All this points very strongly to Triton having originated in the Kuiper Belt and being captured by Neptune, probably during that chaotic migration period.
What an incredible story for a moon kidnapped from the Kuiper Belt.
Essentially, yes.
Okay, besides Triton, you mentioned the discovery of other large KBOs similar in size to Pluto starting around the year 2000.
That's right. After the discovery of Albion kickstarted the search, technology improved, and astronomers started finding significantly larger objects out there. Since 2000, we've discovered quite a few KBOs with diameters over 500 kilometers. Some of the most famous examples are Quaoar, Makemake, Haumea, Orcus, Ixion, Varuna.
And finding these big ones was crucial for Pluto's story.
It was the major catalyst for Pluto's demotion, or rather reclassification. Finding objects in the same region of space with similar sizes and compositions, especially the discovery of Eris in 2005, which is a scattered disk orbit but turned out to be even slightly more massive than Pluto, really forced the issue.
The issue of what is a planet?
Exactly. Astronomers realized they needed a formal definition.
Yeah.
In 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, voted on a definition that included 3 criteria. A planet must orbit the sun, be massive enough for its own gravity to pull it into a nearly round shape, hydrostatic equilibrium.
And a controversial one.
It must have cleared the neighborhood around its orbit, meaning its gravitational influence must be dominant in its orbital zone, with no other bodies of comparable size around except for its own moons.
And because Pluto shares its orbital space with thousands of other KBOs, some quite large, it didn't meet that third criterion.
Correct. Neither does Eris nor Ceres in the asteroid belt. So Pluto was reclassified as a dwarf planet, a new category created at the same time, and it's now officially recognized as the largest member of the Kuiper Belt population.
How many other objects out there are currently recognized as dwarf planets?
Besides Pluto, the IAU and most planetary scientists generally accept Eris in the scattered disk, Haumea, Makemake, and Quair, all broadly in the Kuiper Belt region, as dwarf planets. Ceres in the asteroid belt is the other one. Orcus is a very strong candidate, often included. Several others have been proposed, like Sedna, which is even more distant, Gungang, Salacia, 2002 MS4. But determining if they're truly round requires better observations, and as we mentioned, some candidates seem to have surprisingly low densities, suggesting they might not be massive enough to qualify.
So a handful of confirmed dwarf planets rule the Kuiper Belt alongside Pluto. And you mentioned binaries are common, especially among the larger KBOs.
Yes, the fraction of objects that are binaries, two objects of comparable size orbiting each other, seems to be significantly higher among the larger KBOs than the smaller ones. Again, this might hint at different formation mechanisms, maybe favoring binary formation during that rapid pebble cloud collapse scenario for larger objects.
What percentage are binaries overall?
Estimates vary, but it's thought that maybe around 11%, or perhaps even higher for some populations like the cold classicals, might be binary systems. The most famous, of course, is the Pluto-Charon system. Charon is so large relative to Pluto, about half its diameter, that the center of mass they both orbit actually lies outside of Pluto, in the space between them. It's truly a double dwarf planet system.
It's incredible how much we've pieced together about these faint, distant worlds just from Earth-based observations and theory. But nothing beats actually going there, right? Which brings us to exploration. We sent a spacecraft.
We did. NASA's New Horizons mission. Launched way back in 2006 with the primary goal of making the first ever visit to Pluto and its moons.
And its flyby in 2015 was just stunning, those images.
Absolutely spectacular. A landmark moment in planetary science. It completely transformed our view of Pluto from a fuzzy point of light into a complex, geologically active world.
But New Horizons' journey wasn't over after Pluto, was it? The plan was always to try and visit something else in the Kuiper Belt.
That was always the extended mission goal, yes. If a suitable KBO could be found along its trajectory that it could reach with its remaining fuel. Finding such a target was a huge challenge because these objects are so small and faint.
How did they find one?
It required a dedicated search using the Hubble Space Telescope.
Okay.
After scanning patches of sky along New Horizons' path, they discovered a few potential candidates. The one chosen was a small object initially designated 2014 MU-69.
2014 MU-69. Didn't it get a nickname?
Yes, it was nicknamed Ultima Thule, meaning beyond the known world. Later, it received its official name from the IAU, Aerokoth, a Native American term meaning sky in the Powhatan Algonquian language.
Aerokoth. And why was it chosen specifically?
Because its orbit placed it squarely within the cold, classical Kuiper Belt. This was exciting because it was dynamically very different from Pluto, which is a plutino shaped by Neptune's migration. Aerokoth offered the chance to see what a truly primordial, relatively undisturbed object from that specific cold population looked like up close.
A relic from the early solar system. When did New Horizons reach it?
The flyby occurred right on New Year's Day, January 1st, 2019. An amazing way to ring in the new year for the mission team.
And what did the flyby reveal about Aerokoth? What does it look like?
The images and data were incredible. Aerokoth turned out to be a contact binary. It looks like two distinct, somewhat flattened lobes or bodies that came together very gently and stuck. Not a violent collision, more like a gentle cosmic nudge.
Like two pancakes stuck together.
Kind of, yeah. A larger lobe, nicknamed Ultima, and a smaller one, Thule. The whole thing is about 36 kilometers long end to end. Its surface appears remarkably smooth in places, with few large impact craters, suggesting it's been relatively undisturbed since its formation. And the Ralph color instrument on New Horizons confirmed its distinctly reddish color, typical of the cold classicals.
Wow. The first close-up look at one of these cold classical relics. Is the data still coming back?
The flyby was fast, but the data transmission takes a very long time from that distance. So yes, scientists are still analyzing the rich data set New Horizons collected during that brief encounter. learning more about its shape, geology, composition, and environment. That gentle merger is a key clue about how planetesimals might have formed in the early solar system.
Absolutely fascinating. Are there any plans for more missions to the Kuiper Belt? Is New Horizons going to visit anything else?
Unfortunately, New Horizons doesn't have the fuel for another targeted flyby. As for future missions, right now there are no approved funded missions specifically targeting the Kuiper Belt beyond Pluto. However, scientists and engineers have designed and studied several concepts.
What kind of concepts?
Well, ideas range from a dedicated Pluto orbiter, perhaps even with a lander, to really study that system in detail. Other concepts focus on flagship-class missions to visit some of the other large dwarf planets, like Makemake or Haumea. Haumea is often cited as a particularly high-priority target.
Why Haumea specifically?
Because it's unique. It's a very rapidly rotating, elongated object. It has at least 2 moons, and remarkably, it even has a ring system. Plus, it's thought to be the largest remnant of a massive collision that created a whole family of smaller KBOs with similar orbits and surface properties. Studying Haumea could tell us a lot about collisions in the outer solar system.
Rings and moons in a collisional family. Sounds complex. What are the challenges for these future missions?
The biggest challenge is always the immense distance and the resulting long travel times. Getting a spacecraft to the Kuiper Belt, and especially slowing down to orbit an object, takes decades with current chemical propulsion systems. We really need breakthroughs in advanced propulsion, solar electric, nuclear electric, maybe fusion someday, to make these missions faster, maybe shrinking travel times down to 10 or 20 years instead of 30 or 40.
So faster travel is key. Any other mission ideas being floated?
There are concepts that combine goals. For example, missions that would first fly by or orbit Uranus or Neptune, and then use a gravity assist to continue onwards to visit one or more KBO targets. That leverages the trip to the ice giants. There was also a specific probe concept studied to fly by the large KBO Quasar, which is interesting because it might have a temporary atmosphere or signs of cryovolcanism before that probe continued on into interstellar space. And orbiter studies have looked at feasible targets like Ixion and Huya, among others.
It sounds like the scientific community is brimming with exciting ideas for exploring this frontier, just waiting for the technology and funding greenlight.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The potential for fundamental discoveries about planet formation, the evolution of icy bodies, and the history of our solar system is just enormous out there. Every mission we send pushes the boundaries of our knowledge.
Okay, one last area. We've talked all about our Kuiper Belt, but our solar system isn't unique. Do we see evidence of similar structures, similar debris disks around other stars?
Oh, absolutely. This isn't just a feature unique to us. Astronomers have found compelling evidence for Kuiper Belt analogs, often called debris disks, around many other stars.
How do they find them? Are they directly imaging these disks?
Sometimes, yes, especially with powerful telescopes like Hubble and now JWST. By the mid-2000s, astronomers had already resolved dust disks that look structurally similar to our Kuiper Belt around at least 9 nearby stars.
And what do these extrasolar Kuiper Belts look like? Are they similar to ours?
They seem to fall into a couple of broad categories based on the images. There are wide belts with radii typically larger than 50 AU, and then there are narrow belts, often with quite sharp inner and outer edges, usually located closer to their star, maybe between 20 and 30 AU. These narrow belts might be tentatively analogous to our main Kuiper Belt in terms of scale and structure.
Sharp edges, maybe shaped by unseen planets orbiting within them.
That's exactly the inference, yes. Just like Neptune sculpts our belt, unseen planets are likely shaping those extrasolar debris disks.
Can we detect them even if we can't image the disk directly?
Yes, quite often. A significant fraction of stars similar to our sun, maybe 15 to 20%, show what's called an infrared excess.
Extra heat.
Exactly. They radiate more infrared light, heat, than expected from the star itself. This excess infrared emission is interpreted as sunlight being absorbed and re-radiated by vast amounts of cool dust grains orbiting the stardust generated by ongoing collisions within a massive Kuiper Belt-like structure. Even if we can't see the individual objects, we can see the glow of their ground-up debris.
So seeing these disks directly, or detecting their infrared glow, tells us that Kuiper Belts are probably a pretty common feature of planetary systems.
It strongly suggests they are a common outcome of the planet formation process, yes. Hubble images have shown beautiful examples of these disks around relatively old stars, hundreds of millions of years old, where the dust has settled into stable ring-like structures. Interestingly, simulations suggest that our own Kuiper Belt, back when it was much younger and probably significantly more massive.
Before 99% got kicked out.
Right. It might have looked much more like some of the brighter, narrower, denser rings we see around some younger stars today.
That's a powerful connection. Looking out at other star systems can literally show us glimpses of what our own solar system might have looked like in its distant past.
It really ties our local neighborhood, our own cosmic backyard, into the universal story of how stars and planets form and evolve everywhere.
Wow. This deep dive has really opened my eyes to just how dynamic and, frankly, weird the outer solar system is. It's gone from being this vague, cold, maybe empty region, possibly cleared out by Pluto, according to early ideas,
All right, the old thinking.
to this vast, incredibly complex, highly structured disk. It's populated by these surprisingly diverse icy worlds, dwarf planets, maybe captured moons, and its whole structure is like a fossil record, profoundly shaped by that dramatic, chaotic dance of the giant planets billions of years ago.
It really is a region that acts as a unique archive. It holds pristine clues, frozen in time, about the conditions and processes at the very beginning of our planetary system. Every new object we find, every piece of data we get back from missions like New Horizons, adds another layer, another detail to that grand cosmic origin story.
It's also clear that this distant, frigid frontier still holds so many secrets. I mean, given the mysteries that remain, like the exact cause of the sharp Kuiper cliff, the apparent deficit of small objects, the precise sequence of events that shaped the cold classical belt and preserved its binaries, you have to wonder, what other large unseen influences might still be subtly sculpting the outermost reaches of our solar system today? And what truly incredible things are just waiting to be discovered by the next robotic explorer that ventures out into that twilight zone?